Welcome back, everyone. This time we're doing something a little different. We're diving into the aftermath of the Titanic sinking.
Oh, interesting.
You know, most people just stop at the ship hits iceberg part, but
Right.
there's so much more to the story. And luckily, you've given us a great episode of the American History Tellers podcast to help us go beyond that, just the sinking.
Yeah.
So it covers the immediate chaos, the investigations, even how the wreck was eventually found.
Wow.
Um, are you ready to see what happens after the unthinkable?
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah.
I think that with historical events, people tend to just focus on the main event,
Yeah.
but the ripples outward,
Yeah.
what happens after, are just as fascinating.
Totally.
And in the case of the Titanic, the impact on society, technology, and even our culture, it's a story that just keeps unfolding.
Okay, so this episode of American History Tellers drops us right onto the Carpathia. That's the ship that responded to the Titanic's distress calls.
Right.
And it must have been just a chilling scene, arriving at the spot where this massive, supposedly unsinkable ship should be.
Yeah, I mean, just picture it. The Carpathia cutting through the fog and darkness, lifeboats just scattered around, survivors in shock, grief.
Oh, yeah.
The podcast really emphasizes how disorienting it must have been, even after being rescued, just to be amidst the wreckage, the icy water, with the journey back to New York still ahead of them.
And that journey wasn't easy either, right?
Yeah, not at all.
They hit some rough weather, which, obviously just added to the anxiety of everyone on board.
Right.
The podcast tells the story of Rhoda Abbott, who was a third-class passenger.
Oh, yeah.
I was hoping you could maybe tell us a little bit more about her experience.
Sure. So Rhoda Abbott's story is truly heartbreaking. She and her two teenage sons were initially denied access to a lifeboat because the boys weren't young enough to be considered children.
Oh, wow.
So unable to leave them, she stayed on the sinking ship with them. And then
Oh, God.
she ended up jumping into the freezing water with her sons and miraculously managed to scramble onto a partially submerged lifeboat.
It's incredible she even survived that.
I know. It's amazing. But tragically, her sons lost their grip and were swept away.
That's just devastating, going through the sinking only to lose your children in the water.
It's awful.
It really underscores the personal tragedies within this already huge disaster.
It does.
And the podcast points out how survivors reacted in such different ways, right?
Yeah. You have Margaret Brown, the unsinkable Molly Brown.
Right.
She immediately took charge, started helping other survivors, especially those from the lower classes.
Mm-hmm.
And then you have someone like Bruce Ismay, who is the managing director of the White Star Line.
Okay.
He kind of shut down, overwhelmed by guilt and shock.
Mm.
I think he spent most of the journey back to New York just secluded in a doctor's cabin.
Wow. So we have these two very different reactions to this horrific event.
Yeah.
And then, of course, they finally arrive in New York.
Yeah.
And I can only imagine what a chaotic scene it was when the Carpathia docked.
Oh, it was a frenzy.
Yeah.
The podcast talks about how tens of thousands of people,
Oh.
they were crammed onto Pier 54 and the surrounding streets. It was this mix of relief, despair,
I bet.
and it was all fueled by the fact that a lot of those initial news reports were just wildly inaccurate. Some papers even claimed that everyone had survived, which of course created this awful false hope for families waiting for their loved ones.
Oh, that's terrible.
Yeah.
The episode mentions a reporter named Carlos Hurd.
Oh, yes.
What was his role in all of this?
So he was actually on the Carpathia and was secretly interviewing survivors.
Wow.
He really risked his career to do it. He smuggled his notes off the ship, and his account became one of the first accurate reports of the sinking, cut through all that misinformation that was just swirling around at the time.
So amidst this media frenzy, you have survivors stepping off the Carpathia, exhausted, traumatized.
Yeah.
And then there's this famous story of the Orphans of the Deep, those two little Navratil brothers.
Oh, right. Such a fascinating story, both tragic and hopeful.
Mm-hmm.
Their father, Michel Navratil, he was traveling under an alias and put them on a lifeboat. But sadly, he didn't survive.
Oh, no.
The boys, they were just 2 and 4 years old, and they couldn't speak English.
Oh, God.
At first, no one knew who they were.
Mm.
So their picture was circulated around the world.
Really?
And thankfully, their mother in France, she recognized them
Wow.
and was reunited with them in New York.
It's amazing that one photo connected them back to their family.
It is.
But it makes you think about all those other stories of separation and loss that might not have had such a happy ending.
Yeah, it does. Every single person on that ship had a story, a life that was changed forever by that night. It's a reminder that the Titanic isn't just some historical event. It's a collection of these really profound human experiences.
Absolutely. And with such a monumental tragedy, investigations were inevitable.
Yeah.
The podcast talks about inquiries on both sides of the Atlantic, in the U.S. and in Britain. What were they hoping to uncover?
Well, the pressure to find answers was immense.
Yeah.
Everyone wanted to know what went wrong, who to blame, and how to prevent another disaster like this.
Right.
Both the U.S. Senate inquiry and the British Board of Trade investigation, despite their different approaches,
Yeah.
they actually arrived at some similar conclusions.
And one of the key conclusions, as I recall, was that the Titanic was just traveling way too fast in an area known to have icebergs.
Right.
Now, that might seem obvious to us now, but
Sure.
the episode suggests there was more going on here than just simple recklessness.
Well, yeah, there was this immense pressure on Captain Smith.
Yeah.
You have to remember, there was this really competitive atmosphere in transatlantic travel at the time.
Oh, interesting.
Speed records meant prestige, and there was this almost unshakable faith in technology, this belief that the Titanic was truly unsinkable.
Yeah.
And I think all of that contributed to this culture where the risks kind of downplayed and warning signs potentially ignored.
And of course, the lack of enough lifeboats. That was a huge factor in the loss of life.
Oh, absolutely.
Right.
But even the lifeboat issue is more complicated than just the numbers.
Okay.
There were these very real social class dynamics at play.
Really?
Third-class passengers had far less access to lifeboats and even information during the evacuation.
Oh, wow.
Their chances of survival were significantly lower, which really highlights the stark inequalities of the time.
The podcast also spends some time focusing on the scrutiny that Bruce Ismay faced, surviving while so many, especially women and children, perished.
Yeah, understandable.
It caused a lot of controversy.
It did. The American inquiry was especially harsh on him.
Really?
They questioned every decision he made during the sinking. There was this feeling that he, as a leader and a man, should have gone down with the ship.
Wow.
The British inquiry, while acknowledging all the controversy, concluded that his actions weren't criminal.
Okay.
But the debate about his actions and the ethical dilemmas of that night, well, they continue to this day.
So we have all this initial chaos, the investigations, trying to make sense of the unthinkable, and then, well, the story of the Titanic doesn't just go away.
It doesn't.
There's this decades-long quest to find the wreck, to locate this missing piece of history.
I'm finding it wasn't just about curiosity either. It was a real technological challenge, this push into the depths of the ocean.
Yeah.
But get this, it actually has its roots in a surprising place. The Cold War.
Cold War. Now, that's not a connection you hear every day when talking about the Titanic.
I know, right? It's a fascinating twist. It is, isn't it?
Yeah.
So the technology needed to find the Titanic, to explore those depths, was being developed partly because of Cold War tensions. Robert Ballard, the man who eventually found the wreck, was working with the U.S. Navy.
So the Navy was really interested in deep-sea exploration.
Oh, yeah, very much so. They were especially interested in finding 2 nuclear submarines that had been lost in the Atlantic.
Okay.
Ballard was using this new deep-sea technology, like this remotely operated vehicle called Argo, to search for them.
And the Titanic search was sort of a side project?
Kinda, yeah. The Navy agreed to fund Ballard's search, but only after he helped them find the submarines.
Oh, wow.
So Ballard went out, located the subs, and then he had just a short time to actually look for the Titanic.
And he found it.
He did.
It's amazing. The podcast describes that moment of discovery, like his team huddled around the monitor, watching the images from Argo as it scanned the ocean floor.
Oh, yeah. September 1st, 1985.
Wow.
They spot something on the sonar, send Argo down, and boom, there it is, the Titanic's boiler, this huge piece of machinery, unmistakable.
I bet.
Must have been just this wave of emotions, excitement, awe, but also that sobering realization that they were looking at a gravesite for over 1,500 people.
And the podcast mentions that Ballard and his team actually had a moment of silence on deck, acknowledging the lives lost.
Yes.
It seems like he really had this deep respect for the site, not just seeing it as a shipwreck, but as a gravesite.
Yeah, and Ballard's approach to the wreck was actually pretty controversial at the time.
Oh.
He decided not to salvage anything. No artifacts. He believed that the Titanic should just be left alone as a memorial.
That's interesting.
This sparked some debate, with some people arguing that recovering items, artifacts, could give us valuable historical insights.
I could see that.
But Ballard, he felt very strongly about keeping the site intact.
And his decision sort of set the tone for the ethical questions we're still grappling with today.
Yeah, exactly. Should we be retrieving artifacts? Is it a gravesite or a historical resource?
Right.
There are no easy answers.
And then those questions get even more complex with the expeditions that came after Ballard, right?
Oh, yeah?
Some of them did salvage items, bringing up pieces of the ship, personal belongings,
Yeah.
things that give us these tangible connections to the people who are on board.
Right. And while it is controversial,
Sure.
those salvaged artifacts have given us a glimpse into the lives of the passengers, the crew.
Yeah.
We see the china patterns they used in the different dining rooms, the everyday objects they carried.
It's fascinating.
It really personalizes the tragedy in a way that statistics just never could.
But those glimpses come at a cost.
Right. Every dive, every retrieval
Yeah.
could disturb the site, speed up the decay of the wreck. It's this constant balancing act, wanting to learn more, but also responsibility to preserve what's left,
Exactly.
for future generations.
And then, of course, you have James Cameron's film, Titanic, in 1997,
Right.
which just brought this whole new wave of interest to the story.
It did. It introduced it to a whole new generation.
Yeah, total.
Cameron's film, it wasn't a documentary or anything.
Right.
But he did incorporate a lot of historical detail, even used some footage from dives to the wreck.
Oh, wow.
And it really sparked this renewed fascination with the Titanic. And not just the sinking, but the people, the social dynamics, the technology.
It's such a compelling story.
It is.
And it brought up those ethical debates again, right?
Of course, yeah. So
Yeah.
should we be making blockbuster films, profiting from this tragedy? What about the tourism, the impact on the wreck site?
Oh, good question.
Yeah, and then in recent years, you have companies offering dives to the wreck
I've heard about those.
in submersibles.
Yeah,
It's an incredible opportunity, but so expensive.
right.
It raises all these questions about access, elitism,
Totally.
and of course, there's the environmental impact too. Are we loving the Titanic to death?
It's a valid concern.
Yeah, and then of course, that tragic implosion of the Titan submersible in 2023
Oh, yeah.
really brought those questions into focus. It was a horrible reminder of the dangers involved, even with all our modern technology.
It was.
And it just added another layer of tragedy to the story.
It did. The Titan incident also made people question the regulations around these kinds of expeditions.
Definitely.
The balance between exploration and tourism and just our responsibility to protect the site and the people who go down there.
It's a complex issue.
It is. It seems like the Titanic just keeps teaching us, even all these years later.
It does.
Reminding us of the power of nature, the limits of what we can do, and just that human need to make sense of things.
To find meaning in the midst of tragedy.
Exactly. Speaking of connections, let's shift back to the survivors for a bit. The physical and emotional scars they carried, they stayed with them long after the rescue.
Oh, yeah, they did.
Can you maybe talk a little bit about what some of them went through in the aftermath?
Sure. Many survivors struggled with what we now call survivor's guilt.
Right.
Why them? Why were they spared when others, sometimes entire families, perished?
That's got to be a heavy burden to carry.
It is. The podcast talks about how some, like Margaret Brown, turned their grief into action.
Molly Brown is such an interesting person. She wasn't content with just surviving. She really wanted to make a difference.
She did. She really did. She became an advocate for safety improvements in the shipping industry.
Oh, wow.
She pushed for more lifeboats, stricter regulations, better training for crews.
Really?
She used her platform to try and prevent something like the Titanic from ever happening again.
It's inspiring to see how she took that experience and turned it into something positive.
It is.
Trying to create good out of such a horrible tragedy.
Yeah, but not everyone had that kind of strength.
Right.
The podcast mentions Frederick Fleet, the lookout, who first spotted the iceberg.
Oh, right.
His story is really sad. He testified at the inquiries, and he was just haunted by what happened that night.
Oh, man.
Tragically, he later committed suicide.
Oh, that's awful.
It reminds us that trauma can have these really long-lasting effects, and that getting help, talking about what happened is just so important.
Yeah, it is. And we can't forget about the families of those who died either. The podcast talks about the town of Southampton, England, where many of the crew members lived.
Oh, right.
Imagine the collective grief in that community.
It must have been devastating. Over 700 crew members from Southampton alone died on the Titanic.
Wow, that's a huge number.
It is wives, children, parents, siblings, all left to deal with this sudden, unimaginable loss. The impact on that community and communities around the world was just immense.
It really highlights those ripple effects of a tragedy like this.
It does.
The Titanic didn't just claim the lives of those on board, it affected families, communities, even entire nations.
Right.
And its impact is still felt today. It's amazing how, even after all this time, The Titanic still fascinates us. We've explored the sinking, the investigations, the search for the wreck. But what about the question of blame? After a disaster like this, it seems like everyone wants to find someone or something to hold accountable.
Yeah, you're right. It's a natural reaction. We want to understand these tragedies, and so often that means finding a cause, a reason, someone to blame. And in the Titanic's case, a lot of the early focus was on Captain Smith, his decisions, the speed of the ship.
Right, especially in those icy waters.
Exactly. There was scrutiny on the White Star Line, the ship's owners, their focus on speed and luxury, maybe at the expense of safety.
And of course, the lack of enough lifeboats, that was a huge issue.
Oh, absolutely.
But it seems like over time, the conversation has kind of shifted, right? We're not just looking for one person to blame, we're looking at the bigger picture.
Yeah, you're right. Historians have been pointing to that culture back then, this almost blind faith in technology, this belief that humans could conquer nature.
That we could control everything.
Exactly. The Titanic was supposed to be the pinnacle of engineering, unsinkable. And maybe, just maybe, that overconfidence led to some risks being downplayed, warnings being ignored.
It's easy to see how that could happen.
It is. And then you have the social class dynamics at play too, right?
Yeah, the fact that third-class passengers had a much lower chance of surviving.
Right. It points to a system that wasn't built to protect everyone equally.
It really does. The
Yeah.
layout of the ship, the access to information, the way they handled the evacuation.
It all reflected the social hierarchies of the time.
Yep.
The Titanic, in some ways, became like this microcosm of society, and the tragedy exposed its inequalities.
It's a reminder that technology and progress don't always mean social justice.
No, they don't. But amidst all this tragedy, the Titanic actually prompted some important changes, didn't it?
Yeah, I'm thinking about maritime safety regulations, all the things that changed after the sinking.
Right, it was a wake-up call. It forced the world to take a hard look at how inadequate the safety standards were at the time.
So what kind of things changed?
Well, in the aftermath, they established the International Convention for the Safety of Life at Sea,
Okay.
which led to stricter rules about lifeboats, enough for everyone, mandatory lifeboat drills.
Makes sense.
They created the International Ice Patrol to monitor iceberg activity, and they developed radio protocols for distress signals so ships could communicate more effectively.
It's kind of a bittersweet legacy, isn't it? All these changes, prompted by the loss of so many lives, but they have made sea travel much safer.
Definitely. It's a stark reminder that progress often comes at a price.
It does. And the Titanic's legacy goes beyond those practical changes too, right? It's become this cultural icon.
Oh, absolutely. A symbol of human ambition, what we can achieve, but also the limits of that ambition.
The fragility of life.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And the enduring power of the ocean.
Yeah, it really forces us to confront our own mortality, doesn't it? Even with all our technology, we're not invincible.
Not at all.
Huh.
And, even in the face of this immense tragedy, there are stories of incredible courage, selflessness.
Oh, yeah, for sure.
The bandsmen who played as the ship was sinking. The mothers who put their children on lifeboats knowing they might never see them again.
That just breaks my heart every time.
The crew members who stayed at their posts until the very end. These acts of humanity in the midst of all that chaos and fear.
Yeah.
It's a testament to the strength of the human spirit.
It really is. This has been such a thought-provoking deep dive. We've covered so much, from the sinking itself to the wider impact on society and technology. As we wrap up, I'm curious, what's your biggest takeaway? What do you hope our listeners are thinking about after exploring the Titanic's aftermath?
Well, for me, it's realizing that the Titanic is more than just a shipwreck, right? It's a story that keeps resonating with us because it speaks to something deeper about what it means to be human, our dreams, our relationship with technology and nature.
Our capacity for both good and bad.
Exactly. It's a story that makes us think about the choices we make, the risks we take, the legacy we leave behind.
It's a powerful reminder that history isn't just about dates and facts. It's about the human stories.
Yeah, the stories that shape history and are shaped by it.
Exactly. And the Titanic, as tragic as it was, offers some valuable lessons, sparks important conversations.
It reminds us of that enduring power of the human spirit.
Well said. Thank you for joining us on this incredible journey.
It's been a privilege to explore this with you.
Wow.
And to our listener, I encourage you to keep diving deeper into this story, to explore the source material, and to come to your own conclusions about the Titanic and its legacy.